The Germans fought World War I, as far as handguns were concerned, principally with the Luger and with the Broomhandle pistols, the Mauser pistols. And very likely there was a host of other small, overgrown pocket pistols that German officers felt obliged to carry in beautifully polished holsters that their orderlies had to tend to every night. But soldiers who actually went on raiding parties and things like that very probably carried either Lugers or Broomhandles, and I would guess in some cases the Reichswehr revolver, which was a big, awkward, clumsy thing that, well, it didn't compare with a Colt single action.
When they say that the Germans can over-engineer something to the point of it being nearly useless, that is no more evident than anywhere else when it comes to the Reich revolver. Here you have a gun that has more moving parts than most automobiles that I've looked under the hood of.
Well, the Reich's revolver ended up with a fairly small hand grip, an enormous cylinder, and it's not a very well balanced weapon to shoot. It was a big clunky gun that the Germans were, I think, well glad to be rid of when they got the Luger in 1908, although some of these Reich's revolvers, of course, still were carried in the trenches during World War I.
Most of the major military powers of the world, by the turn of the century, and even into the 1890s, knew that the semi-automatic pistol would be important. They knew it would be the coming thing. Using the energy of a fired cartridge to extract, eject the empty cartridge, then load a fresh one from a magazine of some sort to be ready to fire rapidly again. This was something that all of the world's militaries were interested in. The modern handgun took a major step with the 1893 Borchardt, designed, of course, by Hugo Borchardt. And this is a gun that used a toggle action that you'd later see in the Luger. But the Borchardt had something that other guns did not at that time, and that is a detachable box magazine located centrally in the grip. This is a huge design feature and one that would spread to virtually all effective handguns.
The Luger is one of those pistol designs that people recognize. Certainly a breakthrough in terms of firearms design of that era. Now that said, it's a complicated design. It's a design that does not stand up well to dirty, gritty, muddy conditions, and it's a design that tends to be a little bit ammunition sensitive.
The Luger did not function as well as would have been hoped for a gun that was going through combat conditions in the trenches. The interesting thing is, we already knew that. And the reason was because in 1907, when we were running our own pistol trials to develop a semi-automatic, the Luger in .45 ACP was one of the guns that was submitted in the competition. From the very records of the commission, it did not function very well under the salt water test and the dirt and dust test that they submitted the other guns to. And those deficiencies came back to bite them during the Great War, because the Great War was all about being subterranean in a trench with a great deal of mud and pestilence and rain and dirt and dust. And the Luger doesn't have the tolerances to function in that kind of environment with great efficiency.
So the military semi-automatic pistol on the eve of the Great War was still really in development. The United States had adopted the U.S. model of 1911, which is in service today. But most nations were using guns that would not stand the test of time, certainly not a century. Some would serve for 50 years. The Luger pistol, adopted in 1908 by the Germans, was still in use by the Germans in 1945 and even by the East Germans to some extent into the 1950s. The Luger pistol was a landmark design because it was the first huge European power that adopted George Luger's design. And the Luger was simply cool. It was a gun that looked like no other. Even to this day, people can pick out the silhouette of a Luger. And the Luger was very prized as a war trophy, as loot from the enemy, as something to bring home. And that's why there are literally hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of Lugers in the United States these days.
Right around the turn of the last century, around 1900, it was obvious that new designs were coming out for semi-automatic handguns, pistols. And the first of these that was really successful was the Mauser, model of 1896, commonly referred to as a Broomhandle. Although the Mauser Broomhandle was first offered in 1896, the German Army didn't adopt it until well into the war, and when they absolutely had to have it.
The Mauser Broomhandle is a great semi-automatic pistol, and one that I think is very underrated. A lot of people say, well, it was never the never the standard sidearm. It was always what you'd call a substitute standard or an additional gun to fill in the void. But you know, when you look at the sheer numbers of them, they totally eclipse the Lugers of the time period.
The 1896 Mauser Broomhandle saw a lot of military use in the World War I era. Germans were using it, Austrians were using it. It was copied. The Spanish were making copies of it. The Chinese were making copies of it. They loved it in China. So there's this great early successful semi-automatic pistol design by Mauser that was never really officially adopted by Germany, but still saw a lot of use and a lot of military actions in that era.
The German Army rechambered many of those for 9mm Luger because that was the standard pistol round for the German Army, and in order to ensure that troops weren't mix and matching 30 caliber Mauser ammo with 9mm Luger, they branded a 9 on both sides of the grip and then painted it, just to make sure, painted it with red paint inside it too.
The Broomhandle had very optimistic sights. You had sights graduated to like 800 meters with a 9mm cartridge. And while the use of a Broomhandle at that range is ridiculous, at the end of 1914, when the trench system eventually stretched from the English Channel all the way to Switzerland, a gun like a Broomhandle can be very, very handy when fighting in close quarters in the trenches. And it also provided semi-automatic firepower.
One of the most fascinating things about the Broomhandle, and try and do this today with any gun, is the fact there's not a screw in it. There's not one single screw except for the one that holds the grips to the frame. Everything interlocks. The whole gun can come apart just by shaking it compulsively, and you can find out how the thing goes together. It's like the world's coolest jigsaw puzzle, because if you get it right, at the end you got a working gun.
The Germans, I think, can be credited with two very important developments in the handgun field that were proved in World War I. The two cartridges. The 9mm Parabellum cartridge, which the Germans adopted in 1908, the Patronen 08, and the 7.63 Mauser cartridge, both of which, respectively, were the standard cartridges for those two standard handguns. And they set the standard for the world after that. The Germans knew the 9mm was the cartridge they wanted, and 80 or 90 years later, the United States agreed. So if you're looking for a German contribution in handguns, that's it. It's in the munitions, not necessarily in the gun.